Hello and welcome to my presentation on multimedia and STEM education. I've organized this presentation into the sections that you can see pictured on the screen. So to begin, what is STEM education? What is STEM and why is it all so important? People have long used technology and engineering in order to be able to connect our globe. As far back as the 1500s and 1600s, they used the technologies that were designed with engineering to sail across the ocean, to map and chart our waters. And we still use technologies and advancements to connect our world today. We're driven by a global economy and global connectivity and also global communications. We are connected. Fueling these advancements are the collective fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM. Recognizing the need for ongoing development in STEM and the necessity of attracting, training, and employing STEM professionals of the future. Both private and public entities have invested in STEM education. Crane and Weber reported that both Presidents Obama and Trump invested billions annually in STEM education, and governors such as Pennsylvania's Tom Wolf are continuing the effort by investing additional support in STEM education. The idea is that by providing STEM education, we will attract and train today's digital native students to enter into those technical careers of tomorrow. So, what skills are required for the next generation of STEM professionals? In addition to content competencies, tomorrow's STEM professionals will, according to Kramer, Olson, and Walker, require scientific literacy. Morrison, Reyna, and Mayer, and Wilson and colleagues report the necessity of other 21st century skills. These include digital literacy, information literacy, collaboration, time management, critical thinking skills, and problem-solving skills. It is important to note, though, as Tucker and colleagues reminded in 2017, that the students of today, while digital natives, still require instruction and support in using technologies, including multimedia, and especially for using them in educational settings. So by providing and intentionally providing instruction for students and access to and using multimedia in the classroom, teachers are actually helping to develop these 21st century skills and help prepare students for those careers of the future. Educational technologies include multimedia, which combines two or more media. This section explains foundational multimedia principles supporting theories as described by doctors Clark and Mayer, with additional research supported by Brame from 2016, Chia and Leong in 2019, and Worku in 2019. Barr and Tagg in 1995 and Heinemann and Goldstein in 2020 contributed to the idea of student-centered active learning, or SCALE. While not exclusive to multimedia, SCALE serves an important role in guiding how we use multimedia in the classroom to be most effective in supporting learning. Therefore, I'll be discussing student-centered active learning, or SCALE, in this section as well. So what is multimedia? Multimedia combines two or more media, audio and visual. Clark and Mayer recommends keeping your visuals very clean, uncluttered, and focused on the content. To that end, they recommend static images or a series of static images instead of busy videos like the one you see. This depicts a stem cell in mitosis, which is cell division, but is very busy. And so you can kind of lose track of what you're supposed to be looking at. An animation such as this one, also depicting mitosis, does a better job because it allows the learner to focus on just what's moving, and that's controlled by the animator, so you can highlight what you want to see. However, Clark and Mayer say that a series of static images, such as this also depicting mitosis, is the best way to support most learners in most situations. The point of learning is to get the information and acquire it in long-term memory. So how exactly does that work, and how does multimedia fit into it? Learners acquire information by putting it into first their working memory. They do that by taking information that comes in through audio and visual inputs and putting it in working memory. They actually combine both inputs together. They integrate them in working memory. There, they transfer information into long-term memory. What isn't transferred is forgotten. So by using the dual channels of audio and visual and integrating it in this dual channel processing, you can actually help support students learning better. Why? Because working memory is limited. And if you have an overstimulation of input from one channel, say the visual channel, then that stresses the working memory and more information is forgotten. If you can instead transfer some of that information from the visual input into audio by removing text and instead narrating, you can actually support learners in getting the information into working memory and not straining working memory as much, and so therefore better support students' learning. Dual channel processing then works in conjunction with modality and multimedia to reduce the load on working memory and improve learning. Cognitive load theory refers to the amount of mental effort it takes to learn something. It consists of three components: intrinsic, germane, and extrinsic. Intrinsic is the difficulty in the task. Germane is the amount of mental effort it takes to actually move the information into long-term memory. Extrinsic load is the mental effort required of the activity, but not part of the learning. Therefore, intrinsic and germane are essentially fixed quantities for a particular topic or content, but extrinsic can be controlled by the learning environment and the design of the instruction. Dual channel processing, for example, and clean graphics reduce visual load. They then also reduce working memory loads. Therefore, by reducing the extraneous cognitive load, you're effectively improving learning. To discuss contiguity, we will refer back to that static graphic of mitosis. I'm going to share with you two different versions of this graphic. Your goal is to figure out what's going on with those little red squiggles, which are chromosomes, and the names of each of the process. I'll give you just a couple seconds, but feel free to pause the video and take as much time as you need to examine each of the graphics. Here's the first version of this graphic. And here is the second version of this graphic. So which one was easier? Which one required less mental effort to figure out? Why? According to the contiguity principle, this one was easier to use. Why? Because this one required your eye to travel from the number to the keyed number in order to find the name. That causes you to keep more information in your working memory, which puts a strain on your working memory. So instead, by locating the labels near the graphic that it's describing, it reduces the visual input load and drops that whole extraneous cognitive load altogether and can help improve learning. The same concept applies to narration. You want to present the images that you're talking about at the same time you're talking about them. It's the contiguity principle. The redundancy principle is also discussed by Clark and Mayer. We'll model that one here briefly. What I'll do is I will share a part of a narration for describing the steps of mitosis. In the first one, I will read to you and you can watch the images. In the second one, I will actually display the words so you can follow along. See which one you prefer. So for the first one, here we go. Mitosis, the process cells use to replace worn out and damaged cells and to grow, occurs in 6 phases. In the first phase, interphase, the chromosomes replicate and the cells prepare to divide. Here is the second version. Mitosis, the process cells use to replace worn out and damaged cells and to grow, occurs in 6 phases. In the first phase, interphase, the chromosomes replicate and the cells prepare to divide. So, which one was easier for you to follow? Which one helped you learn, or which one maybe distracted you a little bit more? According to the redundancy theory, when you have the terms on the page, when you have the text that's redundant with the narration, it actually distracts the learner. Your attention is divided, or split attention, so that you are thinking about what I'm saying, but matching with the words. And so if I trip over my tongue, if I'm reading faster than you are or slower than you are, then your mind is trying to integrate it and pair it. That increases cognitive load and decreases learning. So while there are times when it's important to use redundancy, Clark and Mayer recommend generally avoiding redundancy for best practices. There are other recommendations on how to use multimedia. For example, Brain reported that signaling can really help students focus in on important content. Signaling can occur in a number of formats. For example, you can use color. You can time the appearance or disappearance of text and graphics. You can bold terms. You can use circles and arrows to highlight sections of your graphics or sections of your screen. In addition, she strongly recommends keeping your videos short and focused on just the content necessary to instruct the students on the topic at hand and meet the end objectives. Kuhl and Munzer in 2019 and Yu and Bjork in 2017 also recommend the idea of weeding. In weeding, you're eliminating extra information, whether it's a decorative graphic or seductive detail, kind of like some of the information I started to present to you about those early explorers several slides ago. What happens is that extra information enters into the working memory, taking up space effectively and decreasing the learning effectiveness for the learner. So weed it out and you do better. Now, this last one on here is a little controversial. Koch and Janukta in 2020 reported that system pacing works best when used with narration and graphics. There are some other researchers, particularly Clark and Mayer, and also, I just lost her name. There's another researcher I'll talk about in a couple slides that support using self-pacing and giving the students control. So there's a little more research in that area. Now, student-centered active learning scale is an instructional approach. Traditional instructors used an instructor-centered approach where the teacher was in the center and the students were expected to passively acquire the information by moving it from their working memories into their long-term memory. Work by Barr and Tagg in 1995 and others, such as Heinemann and Goldstein in 2020, strongly recommend changing the teacher's role to facilitator and focusing on the student. This creates educational opportunities and instructional opportunities for students to make meaning through collaboration, discovery, and through actively engaging with the content. Students do have to work harder in this active environment, this scale environment, but scale supports depth of learning while also supporting students in learning important 21st century skills, such as collaboration, problem solving, critical thinking, and time management. Multimedia can create a powerful learning environment for students to not only gain depth of content knowledge, but also acquire those important 21st century skills are essential for moving into careers of the future. Now, STEM's impacts seem to be everywhere. Technology is everywhere. We use it in communication and education, commerce, social activities, entertainment. The list goes on and on and on. And is based in innovation, often associated with STEM. So despite all of this, we're still losing interested students out of the STEM pipeline. Researchers like Crane and Weber and Barak and colleagues are conducting research in how we can retain students in the STEM pipeline. And multimedia is one way to help do that. Multimedia uses technology. Today's students grew up with technology and are digital natives. As described by Morrison in 2021, they prefer technology and often opt to use it in their own time. Tucker and colleagues, as well as Zhang and colleagues, emphasize that students do best when they're taught how to use the technology, especially for ways that they're not used to, so for educational purposes. But that by using multimedia, you're increasing their engagement and motivation, and you're tapping into their interests. Motivated, interested, and engaged students learn, and therefore, multimedia helps students. Pat Reed in 2017 was studying how to support instructors in adopting and using multimedia and technologies in the classrooms. Pat Reed reported that people tend to use technologies that they've been exposed to and that they had positive experiences with. That also builds their confidence, and this makes sense to me. Students, too, will benefit from technologies and multimedia in the same way. Therefore, by increasing the use of multimedia in the classroom, we are increasing the interest, engagement, and motivation of students. We're giving them confidence and exposure to multimedia. We're building digital literacy and digital competency skills. And these are all things that are going to help prepare them for the future in career and college readiness. Additionally, Reed recommends, though, that you match the multimedia with the job that you want it to do. For example, if you try to fit a square peg into a round hole, it's not going to work. So if you simply force multimedia into your classroom just for the purpose of the multimedia, it's not going to be nearly as effective as if you're intentionally applying it to solve a problem or better support students in that environment. This also allows students to see how selective use of multimedia can benefit in multiple jobs. Multimedia lends itself to options and choices and for individualized instruction and learning. For example, students can choose between different types of activities in digital workbooks and in e-workbooks in order to practice their specific skill sets needed for math, science, whatever you're working with. Multimedia such as PowerPoint can also support students within the class to visualize or to hear an audio or to watch a short animation or video clip. WorkCode strongly recommends, though, that remembering to use multimedia, especially PowerPoint, as a tool within a scale environment. Otherwise, PowerPoint used as another means of passive instruction. Multimedia can serve as a learning tool for students to learn and explore independently or as following a teacher-led instruction. For example, Kazarowski and colleagues tested a teacher-led instruction followed by a practice e-workbook system. And Robinson and Zhang used student-generated projects in order to help their students learn best using multimedia. The Kramer team used multimedia in order for students to practice and learn on their own. So there's lots of ways to use multimedia. All of them, when integrated into a scale environment, can help students to best learn not only the content, but those 21st century skills. All students should have access to and opportunities to pursue careers in STEM. Yet researchers such as Taylor and Burnett report multiple accessibility issues for students. This inhibits their opportunities in STEM. And here's the kicker. Multimedia actually supports accessibility. For example, Noop van Kampen, who is the research team I was trying to remember earlier, and colleagues reported that students with dyslexia do best with multimedia. Also, Rodriguez and Escaso, their research in 2018 reported that using accessible videos, which they already knew supported students with disabilities, actually do the best in supporting students without disabilities as well. So they made the recommendation that we should be using accessible multimedia as the rule rather than the exception because it helps everybody learn better. As a technology-based educational tool, multimedia leans into today's students' interests, motivating and engaging them. Using multimedia in the STEM classroom allows students to gain experiences, digital skills, and confidence in using multimedia for academic purposes. It prepares them for using multimedia and technology for future careers. Multimedia supports individualized learning through programs like using digital notebooks, and multimedia offers choices and alternatives in permitting students to create their own multimedia to showcase their learning. Multimedia supports depth of learning in content in STEM, as well as developing 21st century skills. Multimedia supports all learners in learning and is a very valuable tool when paired with scale in supporting our preparation of students entering into the careers of the future. Clark and Mayer and other researchers have provided a lot of guidance on helping to develop effective multimedia. There are some exceptions, and there are some specific practices that are very effective in STEM, particularly when we're talking about things like process learning. So these accepted principles that generally stand, the default principles, if you will, or the default guidance, is to use non-redundant narration, static images, brief videos, remember, brief and focused, and to use narration with graphics, but non-redundant narration, and to keep the graphics very close to the limited text while also using the narration paired with the text. Exceptions do exist, and those exceptions are based on the learners and the specific learning context. One exception is the preference for static images when learning processes. These processes include things like photosynthesis, Kepler's law, and mitosis. Here, with process learning, students learn best when using animations to study these processes. While this video is very busy and engaging, it distracts and you can't figure out where to look. This animation, because of its ability to focus your eye on where the movement is occurring, is actually more effective in learning the process of mitosis than the static series of images is. So it's an example where we're breaking the rule. Many of the studies used to develop the guidelines used a controlled lab environment. However, a classroom environment is very different from a lab environment. And so, for example, teachers frequently use extra information and seductive details in engaging students. The extra information could be because they're including multiple objectives in a single lesson. The seductive details might exist because they're trying to engage those learners. These are great things to do and happen frequently, except they tend to reduce learning. However, if we use redundant text and narration selectively, then we can help students to hear those seductive details that might be intriguing and interesting, but also support them in learning what we want them to learn. Very, very important. Additionally, classrooms may not be always quiet and cool, calm, and collected. Instead, they might be very busy. So if you offer multimedia in a classroom setting that is redundant, it allows students to lean into the input area that is best fitted to the environment. For example, if you had a very busy image like what's going on this slide right here, then you might have people leaning into the auditory. However, if the classroom is super loud, then by providing that redundant text, students can read it instead and gain the information that way. So redundancy does have some exceptions that benefit learners. Another example of an exception to redundancy, the exception to removing redundancy, is when working with complex terms, new vocabulary, or students with dyslexia. Additionally, Knut van Kampen in 2018 and the team discovered that students with dyslexia do best with self-pacing. And so this is another one of those examples where in some situations, you want to provide that self-pacing and give students that control. And in other situations, you want to system pace and support them that way. I think more research will be coming and helping us define those parameters a little bit more closely. Now, we've talked about using multimedia, we've talked about developing multimedia, but how do we know when it's effective? One way that we can actually measure effectiveness is by using rubrics. Rubrics are really very effective because they not only give us the end goal, the learning outcomes, they also describe the intermediate levels and assign point values. It tells us what success looks like from the very beginning so we know what our end goal is. Now, teachers and students can use these rubrics in order to plan backwards so that you're building your instruction and your project to meet that end goal. Students can use rubrics to evaluate their own work. Teachers can use student generated as well as teacher generated rubrics. Zhang and team used a student generated rubric for a student project. You can use a rubric to evaluate an entire course like DeBattista did in 2018, or you can even use a piece of teacher generated multimedia and compare it to a rubric in order to improve it. That was done by the Barackle team in 2021. Remember, the goal of STEM education is to support students in gaining content skills and knowledge and preparing them with 21st century skills for career and college readiness. Multimedia can support students in learning those skills and content and developing those 21st century skills. But students learn best from high quality multimedia employed in a scale environment. While the scaled guidelines based in multimedia principles and educational theories serve as the default best practices, exceptions exist based on the learner and the learner content. And you have to assess to figure out what's going well and to help figure out how much you've achieved and where you're still on that continuum of learning. Research continues to inform and refine the best practices for developing and using multimedia in the STEM classroom. Exceptions to the guidelines exist in specific learning context or with specific learners. Ongoing research may continue to provide guidance and information on where to deviate and how to deviate when we don't follow the default guidelines, or when we should continue to follow the default guidelines. Rubrics have long played roles in helping teachers and students to understand from the very beginning what the end goal is and what success looks like. We can use those rubrics to help support students in learning. But researchers such as Zhang's team are not only having teachers use rubrics, they're also having students design and use those rubrics for their own multimedia projects. Researchers like Lange and Costley and Worko are using student feedback with their students in order at the course level to help refine and continue to develop their courses. Maybe in the future, we'll continue to look at ways that both teachers and students can use rubrics and assessment in multimedia and STEM education. Virtual reality, or VR, immerses the learner in the learning experience, allowing the learner to explore and investigate, often manipulating the environment. Low immersive VR takes place on a computer monitor, and the students use the keyboard and the mouse in order to manipulate the environment and navigate. High immersive VR uses a headset such as this one and hand controls in order to manipulate the environment and to navigate. Both include audio and visual frequently, and they can include redundant or non-redundant text. According to research by Liu and McCransky, both research teams, VR is highly engaging. It is motivating and is significantly preferred by students. However, McCransky and colleagues reported that students do not learn best with VR. Maybe it's too distracting. It actually reduces learning. And so clearly, additional research remains to determine best practices for using VR in STEM education. Researchers are continuing to learn more about multimedia in STEM education. Some research may aim to understand how different learners and learning contexts are best supported by different types of practices, either deviating or following the default guidelines. In other research, we might be using rubrics, either with students or in other assessment methods, in order to help figure out what's going well and what's not, and how we can continue to support and grow with students, both in multimedia and in the whole course. Additionally, additional research is required for not only VR, but also augmented reality in determining best practices. So, to summarize and conclude this presentation, as noted by Crane and Weber, our world has become increasingly connected. It's driven by information and technology. Private and public sectors are looking to STEM education to attract and train students to enter into STEM careers of the future. Education serves as the foundation for filling these necessary jobs. High quality multimedia is a tool that, with student centered active learning environments, can help support students in gaining 21st century skills as well as STEM skills and content. These are essential skills for the future and required for students entering into the STEM careers. Following evidence-based, principle-founded best practices can assist instructors in developing and using multimedia in STEM education to engage students, to help them to learn better, and to develop the necessary skills for tomorrow's successes. Thank you for watching.